Because with me it starts, I mean, some of the stuff that needs to be discussed starts, early childhood.
She was a very loving and joyous person. In some ways that was in spite of her background, in spite of the difficulties of her childhood, how she came to this country. My mother was born May 8, 1931 in Osnabrück, Germany. The family goes back to the Mendelssohns and was of Jewish ancestry. By the time of my grandfather, he was a Lutheran minister. Her mother died in childbirth, so she was raised by a nanny from her earliest years. 1938 on Kristallnacht, that was really when my mother and the family, things really started to spiral downward.
People full of optimism and naivete like my father thought nothing can ever happen.
Church of Hanover, which is his parent church, an underground church that opposed Hitler, he was pretty deeply involved in it.
I mean, there was an article in the paper that said, "That Jew Leo," referring to my father. Bangs on the door and these SS men stomped in.
My mother was standing there when the Gestapo took him away.
The guard searched him, but he didn't take away his glasses or his little leather-bound Bible. And my father says, "I regarded this as an extraordinary act of clemency, a sign of how a spark of conscience can remain basically in anybody."
My grandfather was arrested and imprisoned in Buchenwald concentration camp.
They were always freezing cold. There was very little food. He must have lost 20, 30 pounds.
His parent church had made so much noise on his behalf, it was easier for the Nazis to let him go than it would have been for them to answer all of the concerns.
If he had not been a Lutheran pastor, which he was, he might never have gotten out of Buchenwald alive.
It all became very real for her, even as an 8-year-old, that something was very wrong, and really, in a way, their life was never the same after that. Their belongings were packed up and were sent to the port at Bremen to be transported to the US, but they were seized by the Nazis.
Confiscated it and stole it, and that was it.
My grandfather would make light of this. Whenever there was one of his books that he didn't have, he'd say, "Well, I hope it's on Hitler's night table and he's enjoying it."
My dad had no choice. They gave him a month to settle his affairs and leave Germany. And the first thing he did was put my sister Anne on one of the Kindertransport trains, and hers went to Holland.
A train for Jewish refugee children. She ended up in this boarding school in the Netherlands.
And my father, once he had settled his affairs, followed her to Holland. He applied for visas to the United States for him and for my sister.
When they arrived in New York, they first went to Princeton, where my grandfather had friends. They actually arrived on October 31st, on Halloween. All the children in the family were getting to go out trick-or-treating.
It was okay for me to go to school the next morning, knowing not a word of English. I wasn't allowed to go trick-or-treating.
She came, not speaking a word of English. They stayed with a family called the Peepers. The family that she was staying with was a professor at Princeton. He would sit down with her and each day have her write down 10 words in English that she didn't understand.
And so every night I learned 10 new words.
She would tell the story of going and making deliveries to Albert Einstein and how he would come to the door and this hair.
My father was, he was trying to turn himself as something other than a refugee pastor by becoming a minister for 2 rural congregations in Texas.
My grandfather was called to a parish in Karnes City, Texas. This is a piece of art done by my mother's stepmother, Ava, depicting their life in Texas. They had a garden and they raised chickens and they had a cow for milk.
He was cultivated a half-acre of farmland for, by hand with things like shovels and hoes.
The 5 of them were there living in Texas. That was where my aunt was born.
Anne was a teenager, a high school kid. That's never an easy transition. And she was a high school kid that came from a family that didn't really have a lot of money for nice clothes, for fashionable clothes. Yeah, we were definitely an odd duck family.
Grandmother would make feed sack dresses for my mother and her sister. LIRS, the Lutheran Immigration Refugee Service, was of support to them in the early days. My aunt would talk about receiving care packages from LIRS, now Global Refuge.
13 sweaters in different colors that were all Anne's size. She got all of those sweaters.
My mother would talk about sort of run-ins that she had in her community with people that treated them as Nazis.
I remember there was this lady that lived up the street from us, and 2 different times she walked up to me and spat on the sidewalk in front of me. And one time she called me a dirty Jew, and then the next time she called me a dirty Nazi. And that was like in the 1950s. They were still fighting the Second World War in their brains.
You're a refugee from your country, but then you come to a new country and you're not really accepted there either, because of your connection to the country you had to flee. They would alternate Sunday dinner between a lentil stew and split pea stew. On a good week, when there was some money, my grandmother would buy some hot dogs and slice them up and put them into the stew. My grandfather would pull one of these pieces of these francs out of the stew and say in German, "Ah, thus live the rich." My mother, she got a master's in English literature at University of Arizona. Soon thereafter, she moved to New York. She wanted to work in publishing, especially at this time in the 50s. If you were in publishing, you wanted to be in a big city, especially in New York. She worked for the Lutheran Church. She was the head of the publications division for a time in New York. She had a big focus on social justice, equality, diversity. She met my father in the 50s. My father was very active in civil rights and the civil rights movement. He was a lawyer. My mother tells a story of walking down Broadway, going into different churches to find a church that would marry them as an interracial couple. My mother was she was a lot of fun. She was a very joyous personality. Classic Anne Ellis photograph, the big smile, and this one as well. with my father. My father had his humorous side, but he was maybe a little bit more serious. My mother was more of the lighthearted one. My mother did a wonderful job with me and my brother, in spite of all the difficulties of her upbringing and her childhood.
They're such amazing human beings. She and Bill did such an amazing job with them, and you can tell that they were loved and cared for.
My brother Jonathan loved animals as a boy. We lived in an apartment, a New York City apartment, and he had a duck in the apartment that he kept. We had a duck in the apartment, and he would take the duck out down, in the hallway, down the elevator, out front, so the duck would walk around on the grass and in the trees, and the neighbors were amazed that we had a duck. This was really her passion, her children's writing. One called Dabble Duck, one called The Dragon of Middlethorpe.
3 that were published. One of them actually I illustrated and she wrote. She was a writer and a musician. She played the violin. She wasn't a professional musician, but she loved the violin and did a beautiful job. There's an artist in every generation.
This is a scissor cut of my mother playing violin, 1942. These scissor cuts were something done by this family.
Great-great-grandfather, I think, was the court artist of the King of Prussia.
Not to forget the artists, they're the dominant personalities.
He came here with one suitcase and one 8-year-old daughter, my half-sister, Entchen.
My Aunt Monica runs puppet theater in Iowa. Like my mother, is also very focused on social justice, and she often brings important themes into her puppet shows.
Big thing that you have to look for are unifying themes and unifying ideas and things that everybody can relate to on some level.
There was much common feeling and fellowship among the prisoners. Especially notable is the fact that the few Christians among us had not to suffer at all for our religion. We were regarded simply as fellow sufferers.
She and my dad both had, and I think actually I have it too, an all-encompassing optimism.
He made the most of his life. He taught his children to find joy and humor amidst the adversity. And my mother carried that with her.
She opened her home and her heart to me. She had a really profound impact on me.
And that's all true. Testify to it all.
My mother was able to rise above that and to build a wonderful life for herself here and not forget where she came from and give back to people around her. That to me is a wonderful lesson. That there's a way to move on from wherever you've come from, to build a good life in this country, to have a good family, but to still be there for the other people that may need help the way you needed help. My mother did that, and it was a wonderful thing.